Hi, this is day 1 of week 3 of 52 weeks of vlogging, and it's the last day of the Canadian penny. I like pennies. I mean, I know some people don't like pennies, but I do. I've always used pennies. I collect pennies, I count pennies, I learned to counting pennies, and so pennies have a lot of sentimental value for me, and I can really like them, but Canada's getting rid of them. And I have to admit, it makes sense for Canada to get rid of the pennies. I mean, it costs 1.6 cents for every penny that they make, and pennies are only worth 1 cent. This means that for every $160 that the Canadian government spends on making pennies, they get back $100 worth of pennies, which is a really bad deal. Now, this doesn't mean pennies are going to just disappear or evaporate or, suddenly nobody's going to have any more pennies. They're not knocking on doors, give us your pennies. Ugh. But it does mean that as we spend our pennies, the stores, instead of giving pennies back in change, have to roll them up and then take them back to the bank for cashing in. This means some problems for retailers. If you want to pay with your credit card, it's no big deal. You still get charged the same price as before. But if you want to pay cash, the retailers now have to figure out what to do about the pennies. Let's say if it's $1.03, they'll round up to make it $1.05. Or if it's $1.01 or $1.02, they can round down to make it an even dollar. Which begs the question of, is that really fair? Well, actually, it probably is fair, because if you're paying cash, sometimes they'll round down and then sometimes they'll round up, and they figure that on average it'll balance out. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, that kind of thing. But it's still a headache for retailers. The people at the till have to remember that they can't give pennies back anymore. They also have to remember to do the rounding, because the cash machines aren't going to do it for them. And they have to deal with maybe some pretty confused customers. So pennies are going to be around for a while. Some people are hoarding pennies, hoping that they'll be worth a lot of money. Some people are just taking their time to spend pennies. I'm keeping 1 penny from every year, just for fun. So while we still got our pennies, I figured, let's see what we can find out about them. I have a lot of pennies. A lot of pennies. And if I take this rare earth magnet and hold it over the pennies, not all of them stick. A lot of them stick. This British one sticks. And all these Canadian ones stick. And the thing about the Canadian pennies is that they're all dated between 2001 and 2012. There are no pennies at all that stick that came before 2001. The interesting thing is that some pennies from 2001 to 2012 don't stick. This is a penny from 2005, and it's not sticking to my magnet at all. Here's a handful of American pennies, and none of them are sticking. And here's a pile of Canadian pennies that predate 2001, and none of them are sticking. Here's another interesting thing about pennies. If we take these 5 American pennies and these 5 Canadian pennies and weigh them, you can see that the American pennies are actually heavier. Even though an American penny and a Canadian penny are roughly the same size, width, and thickness. Also, if we take these 10 Canadian pennies that are magnetic, and these 10 Canadian pennies that are not magnetic, you can see the magnetic pennies are a little bit heavier. These pennies were made in the same years as these pennies. They should all be made of the same stuff, but they can't be. Whether or not a penny is magnetic comes down to what it's made of. According to the Canadian Mint, pennies, up until 1996, contained mostly copper. They were about 98% copper. Before 1941, they were 95% copper, with a very small amount of zinc and tin. But then in 1997, they switched it around. They started making pennies almost entirely out of zinc, with only a very little bit of copper plating. So this penny from 1974 is mostly copper, with a little bit of zinc and tin mixed in with it. Whereas this penny from 1998 is mostly zinc with just a little bit of copper plating on the outside. And you can see it's not in very good shape. But then in 2000 came a new change. They started making pennies almost entirely out of steel. This penny from 2006 is 95% steel with a little bit of copper plating and zinc. Some pennies are magnetic and some pennies aren't. The old pennies that are mostly copper or mostly zinc aren't magnetic at all. But the new pennies that are mostly steel are, at least according to the Canadian Mint. But this handful of non-magnetic pennies made in 2005 and 2006 can only mean one of two things. Either the Canadian Mint is a liar, liar, pants on fire, or someone is making fake pennies. I never suspected that there could be any money in fake pennies, but it's possible. So what should you do with your pennies? Should you melt them down for money? Copper's becoming more valuable these days. Well, no, actually you shouldn't. For one thing, most pennies from 1997 onwards have hardly any copper in them. And even if you can get hold of some really old pennies, the copper in them is really not worth the effort of melting them down. The cost of pennies isn't in the metal, it's in the labor and distribution of the pennies. Also, there's the small matter of the fact that it's illegal, both in Canada and in the United States, to melt money. But there are lots of other things you could do. You could stick them in a roll and donate those rolls to your favorite charity. You could also stick them in a roll and just take them to the bank and cash them in for money that you can use better. Or you could do fun things like use them to tile your floor, make a mosaic, make penny coasters, throw them all into a wishing well and make one big huge wish all at once. Whatever you decide to do with your pennies, I hope it's worthwhile for you. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow. Shiny pennies.